Hello, it's Mr. Coates. I'm going to use this video to read to you Hidden Intellectualism by Gerald Graff. Now, if you are using the Buena Reader, this is on page 35 of your reader. Now, because this is a video, feel free to pause, fast forward, skip, come back to anything you need at any time so that you can fully understand this pretty complex text. Now, it's pretty short. It's 4 pages long, comparatively, but it has some very intellectual, I don't know any other way to put that, intellectual words, some high vocabulary. So it may be difficult, but please feel free to stop at any time and look up a word if you don't know it. So follow along in your text or just listen to me read it. Hidden Intellectualism by Gerald Graff. From They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing, 2014. Everyone knows some young person who is impressively street smart, but does poorly in school. What a waste, we think, that the one who is so intelligent about so many things in life seems unable to apply that intelligence to academic work. What doesn't occur to us, though, is that schools and colleges might be at fault for missing the opportunity to tap into such street smarts and channel them into good academic work. Nor do we consider one of the major reasons why schools and colleges overlook the intellectual potential of street smarts: the fact that we associate these street smarts with anti-intellectual concerns. We associate the educated life, the life of the mind, too narrowly and exclusively with subjects and texts that we consider inherently weighty and academic. We assume that it's possible to wax intellectual about Plato, Shakespeare, the French Revolution, and nuclear fission, but not about cars, dating, fashion, sports, TV, or video games. The trouble with this assumption is that no necessary connection has ever been established between any text or subject and the educational depth and weight of the discussion it can generate. Real intellectuals turn any subject, however lightweight it may seem, into grist for their mill through the thoughtful questions they bring to it, whereas a dullard will find a way to drain the interest out of the richest subject. That's why a George Orwell writing on the cultural meaning of penny postcards is infinitely more substantial than the cognitions of many professors on Shakespeare or globalization. Students do need to read models of intellectually challenging writing, and Orwell is a great one, if they are to become intellectuals themselves. But they would be more prone to take on intellectual identities if we encourage them to do so at first on subjects that interest them rather than ones that interest us. I offer my own adolescent experience as a case in point. Until I entered college, I hated books and cared only for sports. The only reading I cared to do, or could do, was sports magazines, on which I became hooked, becoming a regular reader of Sport magazine in the late 40s, Sports Illustrated when it began publishing in 1954, and the annual magazine guides to professional baseball, football, and basketball. I also loved the sports novels for boys of John R. Tunis and Claire B., and audio biographies of sports stars like Joe DiMaggio's Lucky to be a Yankee and Bob Thiller's Strikeout Story. In short, I was your typical teenage anti-intellectual, or so I believed for a long time. I have recently come to think, however, that my preference for sports over schoolwork was not anti-intellectualism so much as intellectualism by other means. In the Chicago neighborhood I grew up in, which had just become a melting pot after World War II, our block was solidly middle class, but just a block away, doubtless concentrated there by the real estate companies, were African Americans, Native Americans, and hillbilly whites who had recently fled post-war joblessness in the South and Appalachia. Negotiating this boundary was a tricky matter. On the one hand, it was necessary to maintain the boundary between the clean-cut boys like me and the working-class hoods, as we called them, which meant that it was good to be openly smart in a bookish sort of way. On the other hand, I was desperate for the approval of the hoods, whom I encountered daily on the playing field and in the neighborhood, and for this purpose it was not at all good to be book smart. The hoods would turn on you, if they sensed you were putting on airs over them. "Who you looking at, smartass?" as a leather-jacketed youth once said to me as he relieved me of my pocket change, along with my self-respect. I grew up torn then, between the need to prove I was smart and the fear of a beating if I proved it too well. Between the need not to jeopardize my respectable future and the need to impress the hoods. As I lived it, the conflict came down to a choice between being physically tough and being verbal. For a boy in my neighborhood and elementary school, only being tough earned you complete legitimacy. I still recall endless complicated debates in this period with my closest pals over who was the toughest guy in school. If you were less than negligible as a fighter, as I was, you settled for the next best thing, which was to be inarticulate, carefully hiding telltale marks of literacy, like grammar, a correct grammar, and pronunciation. In one way, then, it would be hard to imagine an adolescence more thoroughly anti-intellectual than mine. Yet, in retrospect, I see it that it's more complicated. That I, and the late 1950s themselves, were not simply hostile toward intellectualism, but divided and ambivalent. When Marilyn Monroe married a playwright Arthur Miller in 1956, after divorcing the retired baseball star Joe DiMaggio, the symbolic triumph of geek over jock suggested the way the wind was blowing. Even Elvis, according to his biographer Peter Goralnik, turns out to have supported Adlai over Ike in the presidential election of 1956. I don't dig the intellectual bit, he told reporters, but I'm telling you, man, he knows the most. If you don't get the reference, he's referring to an election between Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. Though I too thought I did not dig the intellectual bit, I see now that I was unwittingly in training for it. The germs had actually been planted in the seemingly Philistine debates about which boys were the toughest. I see now that in the interminable analysis of sports teams, movies, and toughness, that my friends and I engaged in a type of analysis, needless to say, that the real toughs would never have stooped to. I was already betraying an allegiance to the egghead world. I was practicing being an intellectual before I knew that that's what I wanted to be. It was in these discussions with friends about toughness and sports, I think, and in my reading of sports books and magazines, that I began to learn the rudiments of the intellectual life. How to make an argument, weigh different kinds of evidence, move between particulars and generalizations, summarize the views of others, and enter a conversation about ideas. I was in reading and arguing about sports and toughness that I experienced what it felt like to propose a generalization, restate and respond to a counter-argument, and perform other intellectualizing operations, including composing the type of sentences I'm writing now. If you don't understand what he's saying, he's basically saying that his experiences talking about sports and other things as a child actually prepared him to become academic. He's saying arguing about sports with his friends is the same thing as arguing about other subjects. Okay, back to paragraph 11. Only much later did it dawn on me that the sports world was more compelling than school because it was more intellectual than school, not less. Sports, after all, was full of challenging arguments, debates, problems for analysis, and intricate statistics that you could care about, as school conspicuously was not. I believe that the street smarts beat out the book smarts in our culture, not because street smarts are non-intellectual, as we generally suppose, but because they satisfy an intellectual thirst, more thoroughly than school culture, which seems pale and unreal. They also satisfy the thirst for community. When you entered sports debates, you became part of a community that was not limited to your family and friends, but was national and public. Whereas schoolwork isolated you from others, the pennant race or Ted Williams' 400 batting average was something that you could talk about with people you had never met. Sports introduced you not only to a culture steeped in argument, but to a public argument culture that transcended the personal. I can't blame my schools for failing to make intellectual culture resemble the Super Bowl, but I do fault them for failing to learn anything from the sports and entertainment worlds about how to organize and represent intellectual culture, how to exploit its game-like element and turn it into a resting public spectacle that might have competed more successfully for my youthful attention. He's saying that he wishes that schools would have made schoolwork more fun and relatable to hobbies that he had and interests that he had. For here is another thing that has never dawned on me and still is kept hidden from students, with tragic results. That the real intellectual world, the one that existed in the big world beyond school, is organized very much like the world of team sports, with rival texts, rival interpretations and evaluations of texts, rival theories of why they should be read and taught, and elaborate team competitions in which fans of other writers, intellectual systems, methodologies, and isms contend against each other. To be sure, school contained plenty of competition, which became more invidious as one moved up the ladder, and has become even more so today with the advent of high-stakes testing. In this competition, points were scored not by making arguments, but by a show of information or vast reading, by grade grubbing or other forms of one-upmanship. School competition, in short, reproduced the less attractive features of sports culture without those that create close bonds and community. And in distancing themselves from anything as enjoyable and absorbing as sports, my schools missed the opportunity to capitalize on an element of drama and conflict the intellectual world shares with sports. Consequently, I failed to see the parallels between the sports and academic worlds that could have helped me cross more readily from one argument to culture to the other. Sports is only one of the domains whose potential for literacy training, and not only for males, is seriously underestimated by educators who see sports as competing with academic development rather than as a route to it. But if this argument suggests why it's a good idea to assign readings and topics that are close to students' exciting interests, it also suggests the limits of this tactic. For students who get as excited about the chance to write about their passion for cars will often write as poorly and unreflectively on the topic as Shakespeare or Plato. Here is the flip side of what I pointed out before, that there's no necessary relation between the degree of interest a student shows in a text or subject and the quality of thought or expression a student manifests in writing or talking about it. The challenge, as college professor Ned Graff has put it, it's not simply to exploit students' non-academic interests, but to get them to see those interests through academic eyes. So I think he's saying that it's best to, if you're a teacher and you're trying to get your students to be interested or to develop their academic skills, it's best to frame them in a non-academic context or a seemingly non-academic context. To say that students need, this is continuing in paragraph 17, to say that students need to see their interests through academic eyes is to say that street smarts are not enough. Making students' non-academic interests in an object of academic study is useful, then for getting students' attention and overcoming their boredom and alienation, but this tactic won't in itself necessarily move them closer to an academically rigorous treatment of those interests. On the other hand, inviting students to write about cars, sports, or clothing fashions does not have to be a pedagogical cop-out as long as students are required to see these interests through academic eyes. That is, to think and write about cars, sports, and fashions in a reflective, analytical way, one that sees them as microcosms of what's going on in their wider culture. If I'm right, then schools and colleges are missing an opportunity when they do not encourage students to take their non-academic interests as objects of academic study. It is self-defeating to decline to introduce any text or subject that figures to engage students who will otherwise tune out academic work entirely. If a student cannot engage in Mills on Liberty, but will read Sports Illustrated or Vogue, or the hip-hop magazine Source with absorption, this is a strong argument for assigning the magazines over the classic. It's a good bet that if students get hooked on reading and writing by doing term papers on Source, they will eventually get to On Liberty. But even if they don't, the magazine reading will make them more literate and reflective than they would have been otherwise. So it makes pedagogical sense to develop classroom units on sports, cars, fashions, rap music, and other such topics. Give me the student any time who writes a sharply argued, sociologically acute analysis of an issue in Source over the student who writes a lifeless explication of Hamlet or Socrates' Apology. Okay, so I apologize for tripping over myself a couple of times there, but that's a pretty tough text to read. There's a lot of high vocab. So if you did not understand everything he said, no worries. You can always read it again, go back, pause anytime, look up words you don't understand. It's not important to know everything he says, just try to get the main idea, which hopefully is apparent. The main idea being that just because something doesn't seem academic, that you can have academic conversations about them, okay? That there's more than one type of intellectual. You can be an intellectual on almost anything, and the person who can talk intellectually about seemingly non-intellectual topics like cars and sports, like he says, is more is more interesting than somebody who maybe misses the point when they're talking about seemingly academic texts or subjects. Okay, I hope that helped. Maybe it didn't. Either way, do your soapstone.